Anybody feel terrible about ACT Science? It's always one that we get some back and forth with students, right? ACT Science. Good news about ACT Science, guys. For those that are watching, okay, I want to just talk to you quickly. There are three question types. Three question types on the ACT Science section. If you focus on the first two, you will do extremely well. Let me repeat that. If you focus on the first two question types, you will do extremely well. And I'll try to go through how you're going to approach these. We call these, right, for those that have watched our science videos, we have what's called the 3-pass method. I'd encourage you to look at that if you can. But there are three question types on the science section. Okay, when we say 3-pass, theoretically, we want you to go all the way through the test looking only for pass 1 questions. But if you feel uncomfortable skipping that many questions the first time through, that's fine, right? You're just looking for either pass 1 or pass 2 questions. They're very similar. Okay, guys, pass 1 questions, there are 25, right? Roughly, let's say 20 to 25 questions. 20 to 25 questions that look just like these pass 1. I'm going to take this off, right? Let's say 20 questions. Okay, 20 questions that are pass 1. And I'll explain what that means in a second. There are 10 to 15 questions, right, that are pass 2, and there are 5 to 10 questions that we call pass 3. And again, in the old days, I used to have students like go all the way through the test, right? You just look for these questions because they are the easiest. Then you come back, you just look at these questions because those are the second easiest. However, there are a lot of similarities between 1 and 2 questions, and you'll see that in just a second. But the bottom line is to get a 30, right? To get a 30, you need to do 0% of these questions. If you get 100% on these question types, right, and those are the easy ones, those are the ones like if you've heard about the ACT Science section before, these are the ones that have nothing to do with science. If you get 100% on those, you get at least a 30. And I'll explain that. An ACT Science score of a 30, just by doing just those questions. All of these questions, okay, thumbs up if that makes sense, guys, because what I'm about to say is absolutely critical to doing well in the science section. Every one of these questions is data analysis, right? It's data analysis. So it's looking at the data, it's looking at some statement that this experiment is making, and it's creating data analysis, right? It's just analyzing a science experiment. Okay, thumbs up, guys, if that makes sense. That's 30 to 35 questions on every science test look exactly like these questions. And there's not a huge difference, which is why we kind of got away from, you can combine these. I still think that from a compartmentalizing standpoint, it's still good to go through these separately, right? And you go all the way through, but pass 1 and pass 2 questions. Okay, pass 1 questions begin with the words, or contain, right? Contain the words according to, and so do these past 2 questions. According to, they contain the words. Okay? They also contain the words based on. So one or the other, right? Based on. Almost every one of both of these question types contain those. The difference is that if you don't see these words, but you see a very direct question, right? And when I say direct, I mean short answer choices. I would write all of this down if you're not familiar with this already, because this can make or break your science test just knowing this information. Okay, direct questions, short answer choices, and one variable, right? Like it's saying one variable. Let me just give you an example, right? So again, this test form that we're using, you guys can find that in the live chat or in the description below. But let me give you an example of this. A very, very straightforward, easy question, right? Working on this, right? And I said confidence level. Let me see if I can pull some of this stuff up. No, none of these. There we go. Here we go. We got a couple here. Okay, so look at right here. So number 15 is a good example of this. I was using this same test form on our last review. It says, according to figure 1, right? Circle figure 1. The nickel, underlying nickel concentration in the nutrient solutions increased. The average iron content of species M did what? Okay, so as the nickel concentration, well, I see, again, the exact words nickel concentration. If you've underlined it in the question, underline it or circle it within the graph. Oh, we're looking at figure 1, sorry, right? I didn't even listen to my own advice. Figure 1, the nickel concentration, right? Nickel concentration is right here. As that went up, right? The average iron of species M, so that looks like this right here, right? Did what? Well, according to figure one, doesn't that look like it went down? It decreased only. It's a negative slope all the way through. Does everybody see that? Right? Thumbs up, guys, if that makes sense. Why we call that a pass one or a one-part question, right? It's literally saying, like, look at this graph and don't make a simple mistake. Hopefully I didn't make a simple mistake there because I almost did, right? I almost looked at table one. Hopefully I didn't. If that's wrong, even if the answer is wrong and it's not B, right? I'm sure there was just some simple mistake there. The point is those questions are extremely straightforward. I don't know anything about nickel concentration. I don't know how it relates to species M or iron. That doesn't mean that I can't get that question right every time. All right, so again, this is absolutely critical that we understand what these question types look like because 30 to 35 out of 40 questions on the science test directly relate to your identification of these questions. If you can identify these, you do well in the science test because it's stress-free. The other questions, and we'll talk about what these third pass questions look like, but the other questions you don't need to know to get a 30. To get a 36, you do, right? But let's start with a 30. If you're not already getting a 30, let's at least start with a stress-free 30. Even if you are getting a 30, this is a great way to take all the stress away from that. And then all of a sudden, when you look at these kind of pass three questions that deal with more of the science or the procedure of the experiment, those suddenly become a lot easier. So again, thumbs up, right? Yeah, harder graph questions. But guys, again, if you take this one, so 6, if you take this one step at a time, or does that say guess, right? I guess it says guess, right? If you take this one step at a time, you don't have to worry as much. Okay? You don't have to worry as much because you are doing this in very specific order. If you are struggling with the harder graph questions, those questions generally relate to these past two questions. And so my recommendation, if you guys are practicing, my recommendation is to do this. When you first start, right, this first one says, according to scientists too. Well, that's a 1, right? We're just looking word for word what that says. You guys can see that we're going to get into these past two questions here in just a second. But I would go through the test based on scientist one's explanation. Even in that conflicting viewpoints passage, right, you're only dealing with one scientist. So you have two pass one questions on that first passage. On this next one, right, even though this one doesn't have according to or based on, does everybody see how these answer choices look very, very simple and straightforward? Right, so that's probably a 1. Doesn't look like there's too many other ones here. Nope, experiment 2, right, this looks like a 1 as well. So maybe 4 questions in the first 14. That should be really straightforward. But the key is, guys, is you have no idea. The science test is not in order of difficulty. I can't stress that enough. The science test is not in order of difficulty. So guess if you're struggling on this, right? If you guys are struggling on the science test, what you need to see is that only 4 out of 14 questions in the first two passages were what we would qualify as like pass one, like straightforward, very direct. Thumbs up if that makes sense, guys, for everybody if that makes sense. But all of a sudden, when we get to passage number 3, and we know, or if we practiced, we know, that the science test is not in order of difficulty, all of a sudden we have 1 question, 2 questions, looks like 3 questions, maybe 4 questions, right? Maybe 4 questions. So 4 of the next 6, right? 4 of the next 6 questions. We had 4 of the first 14, but then 4 of the next 6 would probably qualify as pass 1 questions. So the key is if you're practicing, now this probably doesn't help for tomorrow if you're taking the test tomorrow or taking the test in the coming weeks, but if you can practice this enough and you can identify all the questions, this is how we have students practice. You go through the whole test, you don't look at the questions that closely, but based on what I'm talking about today, you go through the whole test and you try to identify before you start whether or not it's a 1, 2, or 3 question. And then you know, based on your notes, what you're supposed to do on each of those questions. Okay, and you go through it. So my recommendation is to start by identifying the questions because that's really the key of 30 to 35 questions, right? And then these past 2 questions are just less direct. There are 2 variables in these. And the number one thing you have to do, and again, this is why I would recommend that you identify all the 1 questions, you go through and do all of those first, and then you come back to the beginning because that resets your mind. Now all of a sudden you're like, oh, okay, now I know what I'm going into. They are a little bit harder. They are a little bit more time consuming. But hey, I know what I'm doing. Because when you have 2 variables, if you do not eliminate, you are mathematically hurting your chances of getting a good score. If on these 2-part questions you don't eliminate, you are taking more time. You are exponentially increasing your chances of making a simple mistake. And it's not that hard to eliminate. If you guys want to see what I mean by that, you'll see in these answer choices, right? On question number 2, right? Or question number 3 as well. Suppose that no seismic event activity is recorded in the playa where the trails left by the rocks are found would weaken, which of the following. These are those conflicting viewpoints. Let me just see if I can find a more of like a data one. Right? Consider these steps. Right here, guys. According to Figure 1, which of tube A and tube B, if either, had at least one end submerged in a liquid before the clamp was removed? Okay, so let's go back, right? And it says according to Figure 1, right? Does everybody see this? Can everybody give me a thumbs up if you guys are seeing why this would be one of those two-part questions? Who can tell me why? Why would this be a two-part question where we're looking at two different variables? Who can tell me, before I just start spouting off, right? Who can tell me why this would be a two-part question? Anybody? For number 11? Right? And we're looking at only Figure 1, so we're going to go back. We're going to find Figure 1, and then we don't have to overthink this, right? So as we go into Figure 1, we're coming through here. We're going to go to Figure 1. I'm going to circle Figure 1, and it's talking about submerging, right? How to have to check multiple data. We're only going to focus on tube A first, only tube A, and it looks like tube A is not submerged in the substance. Does everybody see that? Two variables, perfect, right? Guess, Avi, that's exactly right. So it doesn't look like that's submerged. So boom, we eliminate A and we eliminate C because A doesn't work. If you look at that figure, right, and this really becomes, when we say these two-part questions, okay, when we say two-part, it's really like, if you get good at this, it's really like 1.5 parts. Because once you see, right, you know that you're looking at Figure 1, but if you commit to this idea of elimination, now all of a sudden, right, we see that Figure B looks like it is submerged in the water. Right? Does everybody see that? And so it's probably just 2B only. Does everybody see it? And again, that's not necessarily the hardest question in the world for these two-part questions, but you have to eliminate. If you go through this, okay, and in terms of practicing, and you write a 2 next to a question, once you, right, so again, what the idea is that you're going to mark all of these as 1, 2, or 3 before you start. Don't look at the questions too closely. Just see if you can identify them. Okay, and you're just going through and you're marking them. And then every time you see that number, based on the notes that we have here, you are eliminating based on those notes, right? Or you're not. If it's one part, right, you don't have to eliminate because you're just looking for one direct number. But if you go back and you look after you're done with the test and you have a 2, right, and you didn't eliminate, it doesn't matter if you got that question right. If you didn't eliminate, you are mathematically hurting yourself because you're exponentially increasing your chances of making a simple mistake on those questions. So again, when we used to do this, what the real strategy of this 3 passes is you go through and you mark 1, 1, 1. If you are good enough at question identification because of practice, you can do this all on the fly. When you get to the real test, you don't have to go through the whole thing and mark 1, 2. Everybody give me a thumbs up if that makes sense. I'm obviously not going to have you do 1, 2, 3 before while you're taking a timed test. But if you practice this enough, you just get really, really good, and you don't have to mark it. You just know, oh, this is a 2-part question because I'm looking at the answer choices and I know that right away. Kind of like what I just did in marking it. And you get good enough at this, and all of a sudden, by the time you're done, you go through all of the part 1 questions first, right? You literally go 1 through 40, and you only answer these 1 variable questions because it's the same steps for those questions every time. You don't have to think about it, right? Does that kind of makes sense? Not to get too intense about ACT science. That wasn't the purpose of today's lesson. But does everybody see that, right? You're trying to get all of those questions done first because, frankly, they are the easiest. They are the most straightforward. Well, geez, if I get 20 of these questions right out of 40, and you don't need to know anything about the experiment to get these questions right, nothing. Just like we saw, if you want an example, what was that number 14 that I just did, I think? Right? Just as an example, right? That's what we want to think about. Quick questions here, guys. I'm see you. I'm just sorry, nothing about. Yeah, guys. So Namai and Mast. Yeah, if you guys are taking the December test, you can take it and still submit your scores for regular decision for American universities. So if you're taking the December test here in a couple months, you can still submit those scores for regular decision. But yeah, to get started, definitely start by taking a practice test. Okay? So start by taking a practice test. There, I posted this practice test that you're looking at right now on the screen. You can see that in the video description below. Okay? But yeah, I would do that. So again, take a practice test, get started there. And it's not too late to take the ACT in December for regular decision. You usually get the scores back within about 10 days, math. You get the scores back within about 10 days, and you should be able to submit those scores before that January 1st deadline. So hopefully that helps. Yeah, Guess, great question there. So Guess brought up a point about conflicting viewpoints passages. So when we see these passages called conflicting viewpoints, you want to, right, in conflicting viewpoints, this is kind of an advanced thought, right? I don't want to get too into that because, with basic review for tomorrow, for upcoming, very upcoming test, if you don't know this already, if you don't know what a conflicting viewpoints, not that if you don't know the strategy, because if you do, if you know what a conflicting viewpoints passage is and you understand the strategy, you're going to do great. It's just I don't want to get too much. Hopefully this makes sense, Guess, but I don't want to get too much into the conflicting viewpoints idea. But I definitely want to answer that question because it's a great one and it's pretty easy to understand. Guys, if you see a passage on the ACT science test, there's going to be one passage. What Guest just posted, there's going to be one and only one passage that we call conflicting viewpoints. So the ACT calls conflicting viewpoints. And there's going to be a lot of reading on this passage, primarily a reading passage, right? When you get to the questions, approach it in the exact same way that you approach the data questions. Conflicting viewpoints passages can be the easiest passages on the test if you know that the majority of these questions, majority are part two, okay? Majority of these questions, majority are past two. For those that just watched, what do I mean by that? What do I mean when I say majority of these questions are past two? Okay, what do I mean when I say the majority of these questions are past two? What do I mean? Okay, if we know that the majority of these are past two, we want to approach those in the same way. So you're going to go through, right? You're going to read through question number 2. You're not going to have read anything. I don't think you should read anything to start ever. Don't read anything on any passage. On passages that are not conflicting viewpoints, if they want you, yeah, perfect Guess, you're going to eliminate, right? You're going to go to the question, and based on the answer choices, those are going to tell you where to read. Just like the answer choices on that number 11 that we just did, right? Told you where to go, right? Which tube A or B. That told you where to look. This one's going to tell you what to look for, right? So we're going to start with scientist 1. If scientist 1 doesn't work, right? If scientist 1 doesn't work, then we eliminate everything with scientist 1. So we're going to say, suppose a researcher observed that wind speeds. Everybody see what I'm talking about here on question number 2, guys? Okay. Suppose a researcher observed that wind speeds greater than 80 miles per hour are needed to move the rocks in the playa. This observation is consistent with which of the scientist's explanations? So guys, I'm looking for 80 miles per hour, right? I'm looking for something about wind speed in each of these scientists. I'm looking for 80 miles per hour. Let's see. The buoyancy of the ice crafts, now evidence is seen in that trails left by article shallow only through the combination of ice, mud, and light winds, the rocks are able to move several hundred meters per day, right? So this says, so light winds, I looked for wind speed. Light winds is probably not 80 miles per hour, so I'm going to guess. I'm going to look at, right, I'm going to guess it's not, but let's just see if they use, I was looking at the bottom. Generally speaking, guys, quick hint on those conflicting viewpoints. Wherever they write these paragraphs in the same format for all of the scientists. So if you see light wind speeds right at the bottom of student 1, it's going to be talking about winds at the bottom of student 2. That's a big advantage in terms of these types of questions. This looks like strong winds, so I think that's 80 miles an hour, and student 3 looks like strong winds. So I'm going to say that student 1 is not true, right? 80 mile per hour winds are not, right? That's a very, very significant wind speed. So no on the ones. Oh, and lo and behold, there's only one answer choice, right? That gives us no student 1. Student 2 and 3, right, are supported by strong wind speed. So I think it's got to be H for that one. If you take this one variable at a time, guys, I cannot stress this enough, that the majority of conflicting viewpoints passages are what we call those past 2. Right, we can see that. Question number 2 is that way. This is a 2 for question number 3. This is a 2, right? Yes, yes, no, no. We have to first decide if it's yes or decide if it's no. So that's a 2 question. This is a 2 question, right? Number 6. So 4 out of the 7 questions, the majority, as I said, are probably going to be past 2 questions. This is true for every question on the test, though, that are 2 parts. That if you focus on elimination right? If that's your first thought, when you see that there are two variables in the answer choices, right, then you are going to do extremely well if you eliminate on those questions, I promise. And then, yeah, another great question from guest. Past three questions, then, guys, those final ones that we haven't talked about yet. Past three questions are all the science knowledge. I call these, there's two categories of these. Extended knowledge is what we say overall. So I would write that down. Extended knowledge are past three questions. And basically, you're looking for any question. When you go through this to practice, right? When you do that 1, 2, 3 next to each question, you're either looking for outside science knowledge, right? So something like, what's the chemical formula of something, or how do you calculate molecular formula, whatever. So outside science knowledge, right? Or, and this is a big or, procedural questions. So it's not necessarily outside of the scope, procedural questions, right? It's not outside of the scope of the experiment. But if you don't know anything, I mean, think about this, right? When you do a science experiment in school, if you don't know what the procedure is and you have to learn it on the fly, right, the procedure of a science experiment, it's going to take you a second to really understand what's going on. So if you see a question, I can give you an example because I already saw one about the procedure, right? If you see a question that's talking about procedure, which of these steps were performed in each trial? Does everybody see that? 13, number 3 is an absolute number 3 question. The cool thing about the science test, guys, too, that I would write down is that the science test, part 3 questions, third pass questions, pass 3, generally show up at the end of the passage. Assume that the room temperature is 25 degrees, and how many trials is the Diet Cola tested at the temperature lower than room? In which of the trials, guys? This is a 3. This is a procedural question as well. And lo and behold, the only past 3 questions that we see on passage number 2 are at the end of the passage, and that tends to be the case. Not always, so don't take me at my word. It's a general trend, but again, something that you should take into consideration. Does that all make sense, guys, in terms of what these 3 parts really look like? Even if you don't have time to practice this, I think if you go in with just this general knowledge, thumbs up, guys, if this makes sense. I think if you go in with that general knowledge of what those look like, you should be in pretty good shape. Is that fair? Anybody have any questions on that? Just like in general, kind of, what I guess what you're looking for, what that all looks like, all that stuff. Okay, guys, again, thumbs up if that all makes sense. And hopefully it does. Let me know. If you guys have any other questions about science, we can definitely go over that. I'm going to show you a couple things on English and math here as well, and just kind of answer general questions here. But definitely, I think the question identification on science is the absolute most critical thing. If you can correctly identify what a question looks like, and you know what to do with that question, there's some more practice that can be done, obviously, than just these basic notes that I've given you here. But the basic notes get you 80% of the way. All right, and so again, I would kind of consider that. I would think about that idea, and what it can mean to keep getting better at those thoughts, those ideas.